Welcome to Queer Conversation, brought to you by LOTL Production. My name is Silke Bader. I'm in the studio here today with Renée Dahlia. Renée is a Sydney-based bisexual cisgender woman who writes romance novels in both contemporary and historical settings across a range of romantic pairings. Her latest series of books is set at Seraph's Burlesque club in London and are all lesbian romances. The first book, Show Up, was released on 9th December, while Show Off came out on the 14th of February. And the final book in the series, Show Queen, will be released on April 12th. This series of books explores the idea of a post-COVID world, which is largely a fantasy in hindsight, and looks at how the hospitality industry had to hustle to keep their doors open during the various lockdowns. Renée Dahlia is an unabashed romance reader who loves feisty women and strong, clever men. Her books reflect this with a side note of awkward humour. Renée has a science degree in physics, and when not distracted by the characters fighting for attention in her brain, she works in the horse racing industry, doing data analysis and writing magazine articles. And when she isn't reading or writing, Renée spends her time with her 4 children, usually watching them play cricket. Welcome, Renée. So you're joining us today. You are an author of lesbian romance novels.
Yes, so I write, well, not just lesbian, but I write romance novels across all the different pairings. So I have a few mostly bisexual MF, so male-female novels. So romance has like a whole bunch of genre coding that you kind of get in the mode of when you're talking to romance readers. So I'll probably throw stuff in like that and you'll be like, what? Hang on. So I also write lesbian romance, which is also called lesfic or FF or sapphic romance, depending on who you're talking to and whatever. And I think a lot of my characters are bisexual, so sapphic fits better than lesbian a lot of the time because it's more encompassing, but FF as well. But then, you know, some people say, oh, FF sort of is a bit dismissive to trans people, and it's like, well, yes, that is true too. So
Great.
sapphic is good because it covers everything, I guess.
Yeah.
And I'm writing a few MM books as well, just because I find the whole spectrum of queerdom really fascinating, I guess.
You're not a new author. You have a background in physics to start off with, and you are working in the race industry. So we just go back a little bit to learn about you. So first of all, you are from Sydney.
So I grew up in New Zealand, and then I moved to Sydney with my ex, and now obviously live here with our children. But I really like it here. Like I find there's a really great community here. I'm not just in the author community, but in the queer community, and having grown up in a small town where that's a bit lacking, I've really enjoyed that side of Sydney.
You've been writing all your life, then?
I've been storytelling all my life. I actually did physics because I didn't have to write anything. Like, it sort of sounds backwards, but I came out of quite a difficult childhood, I guess, in some ways, and I found that doing maths and physics was very precise, and it gave you an answer to a puzzle, and I enjoyed that certainty of it, if that makes sense. And I did a whole degree without having to write any essays, which, you know, I was kind of happy about. But then later on I sort of fell into writing in a long roundabout way, fell into writing for a couple of magazines and taking data and answering questions and then writing it in a layman's terms to say basically, horse people, here's some horse data, but this is what it means, and this is the risk profiles, or, you know, this is a myth that exists. Now we've looked at the data, it either is true or not, and why does that myth exist or persist?
That skill really helps in developing a storyline and with your research, of course. One of your first series was on World War I.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about it.
So my first Sapphic series is basically set in 1919. It's just after World War One. So the first book is Her Lady's Melody. They've all got almost the same title, so if I hesitate, it's because hang on, which one? And I have a whole spreadsheet so I can keep track of all the names. There's like 27 books to keep track of. So Her Lady's Melody is basically a World War One doctor, Luciana. So she went to World War One, worked as a doctor. She's basically the end of the war. She's got shell shock, or PTSD really, but that's what they called it then. And so she goes to Amsterdam and lives with her grandmother just to kind of breathe and relax and figure out what she's going to do next. And she's like, well, I'm trained as a doctor, but I actually can't face being a doctor anymore because I've spent years patching up all these wounded, dying people. And then the neighbour moves in, who is this Russian Revolution escape. So she moves in next door. They kind of have a over the fence, almost friendship, and then the woman from the Russian Revolution, her son falls out of a tree and breaks his arm, and that's the start of the book. And so, of course, she's heard that there's a doctor living on the street. She comes next door and says, I need help from the doctor, and then the doctor has to come over and face her fears. And then they become friends, and then there's a bit of a mystery, and then they end up in England. And
the inspiration come for a historical novel as such?
So this series, so I guess all my series come from like a fairly big idea. So this series came from, I was reading a bunch of non-fiction about women in World War One and all the different roles they'd done. So this series, it's got a doctor, it's got a veterinarian, and it's got a philanthropist, is the second book. And yeah, just that idea of that period of change for women. It's so you've sort of come out of the first lot of suffragettes, then you've had World War One, where women have gone and done real jobs, and there's that impact of that. And I was kind of thinking about that as a big idea, and then distilling it down into individual characters.
After World War One, it's a fascinating time. There was a lot of liberation there for the LGBT community in Europe, France in particular. So
well, and Germany. Look, they did all of that research in Germany that then got burned by Hitler.
That's right. Yeah.
Which, you know, and in the Russian Revolution, like the maddest things happened. So they basically, when they got rid of the Tsar, the people who came in decided that they would get rid of every law in the land. So nothing was illegal for like a few months while they rewrote all the laws, which meant that suddenly being queer was legal, technically.
Yeah. Wow. That would be fascinating to do this research. You love doing research. It's part of your job as a writer.
Yeah, and I find, I don't know, there's like just so many, I really like looking between the lines of history. Like if you think about who writes history, and it's often, you know, straight white men, and then who they kind of hint at but don't talk about. It's those gaps that I like to kind of explore and find. And the information's there, it's just harder.
No, fantastic. Yeah. Now, tell me about your T-shirt, Renee.
So Romancelandia is kind of a collective word that romance authors call themselves, and it's mostly in jest. You know, it's the land of romance that we live in, and readers, romance readers are all, and reviewers, it's all kind of that encompassing whole of people who are really into romance genre novels. And then, I don't know, a few years ago on Twitter, there was some random person who came on and did this big white American Christian spiel about how all romance writers were harpies and trollops. And so, of course, someone in the community made these T-shirts.
Fantastic.
Which is just hilarious.
Fantastic. You know, I really like it. So let's talk about your latest series.
Sure. So,
what's the name of the first book that was released in December?
Right. So the first book is Show Up, which is this one there. And so the idea behind it is I was thinking about, obviously I wrote it in the pandemic, and I was thinking about the impact of the pandemic on hospitality. So my brother-in-law owns a pie shop, and just to watch their journey and how they had to kind of change their business model and cope with all the different rules and lockdowns and whatever was really kind of interesting, and that kind of started a thought of, you know, the impact of that on businesses, and then what would happen if you owned a nightclub. And for reasons, I invented a burlesque lounge in London, and so then the first book is one of the dancers who's also a nurse, so there's obviously the impact. It's sort of loosely written at the time of vaccination, so there's this sort of fantasy that the pandemic's over, I guess. So the whole pandemic is kind of the backstory for the characters, and you start to look at the impact of that rather than living through it. So Yolanda's a dancer and a nurse, and Reiko is one of the bartenders. And she's doing a PhD and kind of has this backstory that's a bit of a secret. And it's a best friends, kind of friends to lovers.
And that's the first book?
Yeah, so that's the first book.
And so the characters move there on to the, obviously you have the same characters, or you introduce new characters for the second and the third book?
Yeah, so kind of the way that romance series work is that you have a collection of siblings or friends or business colleagues or whatever, and each of those people gets their own story, their own love story. So each book is a different couple, but they're all connected, in this case by the Burlesque Club. So the second book is called Show Off, and it's the main MC at the club who organises all the events, and an interior designer who comes in to help like remodel the place. They get like a COVID grant to kind of get them started again, so she comes in and does that, and it turns out that they, before the pandemic, had been hooking up after shows every now and then. So it's kind of like a hook up to I guess friends to lovers, but I don't know that they're fully friends. That kind of comes with the book and the journey. So the third book in the series is called Show Queen, and it's the club owner, and it's the landlord or landlady who owns the building. And in the whole pandemic, before the book starts, they've been online friends. They hang out in the same chat group talking about houseplants. Because, whatever, people talk about all sorts of interesting things online. So they're like online friends, but real life enemies, which adds a lot of interpersonal tension in their book,
You print your books in a hard copy as well as they are available on digital format to download on Apple and Amazon.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to go with hard copy?
I think it just increases your market size. So obviously most of my sales are through digital and audio. The Burlesque Club series the audio is done by Saga, who's a Danish company, I think. I mean, I think it was a big adjustment because I'm used to taking the kids to school in the morning and then having all of that time when they're at school to think and concentrate with just quiet music in the background. And then to manage them all doing online school at home in the same space, it was a bit kind of...
So how many books have you written? You mentioned before 27 or something?
Yeah, so I think I have 27 published. I've got maybe 4 or 5 in the wings,
So Renee, what would you say to young writers who want to give this a go, or are scared of publishing? And I know a lot of people don't know which way to go with publishing. Self-publishing, going through a publisher, is always the question about your rights. And how do you go through this maze of information?
Maze is a good word. Look, I think there's a lot of pros and cons to both. Like, I'm what they call a hybrid published. So I've got some books with traditional publishers through mostly Harlequin Australia, and I've got some that are indie published, and then I've got like the Burlesque series, which I indie published the paper and the digital, and I sold the audio rights to another company, or to a traditional publisher, I guess. I guess that the first thing I'd say is that it's a marathon, right? You have to realise that it's going to be a long process. Even if you sell a book to a publisher, it's a long process to get there, and then it's a long process once you get there, and you quite often don't get paid for a very long time. And probably a lot of your advice is going to be dependent on what type of books you write. Like if you write literary fiction or horror or thrillers or romance, like you really need to understand your market. So you need to read a lot in the types of books that you want to write so that you understand what readers are looking for, if that makes sense. Like it's a business really like any other. And you end up doing a lot of your own marketing through social media because publishers won't do that for you. I just think you have to be prepared you have to decide who are you writing for. Are you writing for you or are you writing to market? And if you want to make money, you need to understand what people want to buy. And it's not to say, well, therefore this is the most popular book, that's what I should write. There's a reader for everything.
There is a really big community on LGBTQI+ writers worldwide and also within Australia that's very supportive of each other. And are you part of that? Are you that helps with the process, especially when you're a young writer?
Yeah, so I guess that would be my second advice to a young writer is find your community, right? So obviously Romance Writers Australia has been massive help to me because they understand the genre of romance fiction really well, and they have an annual conference that's just chock full of information, and all the big publishers come to it. And there's quite a good queer community within that, like as a subgroup, I guess.
Yep.
And then you've got like conferences like GenreCon in Brisbane that does thrillers and mysteries and sci-fi and romance, kind of all that genre fiction. And that's run through, I think, the Queensland Writers Centre, but there's all different writers' centres, and you just find your community is the important thing.
Exactly.
Because, look, you can write anything and people will love it. Like I wrote, for Halloween, I wrote just a short story that was basically the devil but a woman and a random old lady who died. And it's based on a myth that I came across in Wales that I put into Her Lady's honour. And so I just wrote this as a sort of paranormal short story to go with it. There's a big trend in the moment in paranormal romance for what they call monster fucking books. And the theory behind why it's popular in romance readers is that it explores disability. I don't know how true that is, but it's certainly a big thing. So you've got things like Marie's book that's called Never Getting Ogre You, which is like a human and an ogre. She's got a Santa one as well, which is fabulous.
Wow.
There's some really wild stuff out there. There's gargoyles and it's just one of those really niche little trends, and there's quite a lot of queer writers writing in that sort of little trend at the moment.
Yeah. Wow.
Little trend, it's growing big trend. So that's why I wrote this paranormal Halloween kind of devil story to kind of see if I could hit that market. And look, people have found it really enjoyable. So.
Well, thanks so much for coming in, Renee. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.